When my niece Lily told me she wished I'd never been born, I didn't cry. I just stared at her, the child I once rocked to sleep, until she dropped the silver locket I'd given her and walked away. That night, alone in my car, her words kept echoing. "You ruin everything." I thought it was just another wound in a lifetime of small cruelties, until the call from my sister proved that hatred runs deeper than I ever imagined. I had just handed her a birthday gift, a delicate silver locket I had spent a month's savings on. She had looked at it, then at me, and dropped it on the floor as if it were contaminated. My sister, her mother, had rushed over, not to comfort me, but to hustle Lily away, casting a look over her shoulder that was a familiar cocktail of pity and annoyance. It was the same look I had received for nearly 40 years. It was the look that said, "Why must you always be so difficult, Clara?" As if Lily's hatred was a mess I had made, a stain I had left on the pristine carpet of their perfect family life. I drove home to my small, quiet house, the house I had lived in since our parents passed away. It was filled with their furniture, their memories, their ghosts. My own life felt like a ghost, a pale imitation of what it was supposed to be. For years, I had tried to understand the source of Lily's animosity. When she was a little girl, she would run from any room I entered. As a child, she would refuse any gift I gave her, telling her mother my hands were spidery. As a teenager, she simply pretended I didn't exist, an invisible piece of furniture in the family home. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence had been broken by pure, unadulterated hatred. I walked into my house and the silence was a physical weight. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly. I was 62 years old, a retired librarian, a woman who had lived a life of quiet service, of careful words and gentle routines. I had never raised my voice, never had a screaming match, never intentionally hurt a soul. Yet, in the eyes of my only niece, I was a monster. The why of it all was a question that had tormented me for years. My sister, Margaret, would always offer vague, unhelpful explanations. "Oh, you know how teenagers are, Clara." Or, "She's just sensitive, she doesn't mean it." But we both knew that was a lie. This wasn't teenage angst. This was a deep-seated resentment that had been cultivated and nurtured for 17 years, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled my bones, that my sister was the gardener. Margaret and I were the only family we had left. Our parents were gone, and we had no other siblings. We were supposed to be each other's anchors in the storm of life. Instead, Margaret had built a wall between us, and her daughter was the fortress guard, armed with a bow of hatred, ready to fire arrows at my heart whenever I dared to approach. I sat at my kitchen table and thought back, sifting through decades of memories, looking for a clue, an answer. I remembered the day Lily was born. I was there at the hospital. Margaret had been through a difficult labor, and her husband, Tom, was a nervous wreck. I was the calm one. I held Margaret's hand, I coached her breathing. I was the first person besides her parents to hold baby Lily. I had looked down at that tiny, perfect face, at the tuft of dark hair, and felt a surge of love so powerful it took my breath away. I had whispered to her, "I will always love you, little one. I will always be here for you." What happened to that promise? Where did that love go? It felt like a currency that had been devalued, rejected, returned to sender. Over the years, I had tried everything. I sent birthday cards filled with heartfelt messages, which I later found in the trash. I bought Christmas presents that were never opened, passed on to charity with the tag still on. I attended every school play, every recital, every graduation, sitting in the back row, a silent, invisible spectator hoping for a glance, a nod, a sign that I was seen, but I never was. The next morning, the phone rang. It was Margaret. Her voice was strained, artificially bright. "Clara, about last night, Lily is very sorry. She was just overwhelmed. You know how parties can be." "Is she?" I asked, my voice flat. "Is she going to tell me she's sorry?" A heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Clara, please don't make this difficult. She's a child." "She is a 17-year-old young woman, Margaret." And she looked me in the eye and told me she hated me. "Well, maybe if you tried a little harder to be warmer," Margaret suggested, and there it was. the familiar sting of blame. It was always my fault. I was too quiet, too reserved, too much myself. You've always been a bit cold, Clara. People don't know how to take you. Cold, that was the word she always used. It was her weapon of choice. I wasn't cold. I was quiet. I wasn't cold. I was heartbroken. I had spent a lifetime containing my emotions, swallowing my words, because I learned early on that my feelings made Margaret uncomfortable. My sadness was an inconvenience. My joy was a competition. My very existence was a complication in the simple, perfect narrative she wanted for her life. I have to go, I said, unable to continue the conversation. I have things to do. Clara, wait. The real reason I called, Tom and I are going out of town next week, just for a long weekend. And Lily has come down with a terrible flu. The doctor says she needs to be in bed for a few days. We can't cancel the trip, we'd lose all the money. I was hoping, I know it's a lot to ask, but could you possibly stay with her? Just for 2 days. The request was so audacious, so utterly tone-deaf that I was speechless. She wanted me to care for the girl who had just declared her hatred for me. She wanted me to step into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a thermometer and a bottle of cough syrup. Margaret, did you hear what happened last night? I finally managed to say, she hates me. Why would you think she would want me there? Oh, she'll be fine, Margaret said dismissively. She'll probably sleep the whole time. It would just be for peace of mind, knowing someone is in the house with her. Please, Clara, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. We have no one else. No one else. The 2 words that had defined my role in the family for my entire life. I was the last resort, the emergency contact, the one you called when all other options were exhausted. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to refuse, to protect myself, to finally draw a line in the sand. But a small, foolish part of me, a part that still remembered holding that tiny baby, whispered, what if this is a chance? What if she sees you differently when you're caring for her? It was a flicker of hope in a vast darkness, and like a fool, I reached for it. Fine, I said, the word tasting like defeat. I'll do it. Oh, thank you, Clara. You're a lifesaver. Margaret's voice was instantly relieved, the crisis averted, her conscience clear. We leave Thursday morning. Just come over around 9. I'll leave a key under the mat. She hung up before I could change my mind, before I could come to my senses. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet dread. I went to the grocery store and bought soup, crackers, ginger ale, all the things a person with the flu might need. As I placed them in my cart, I felt a familiar pang of longing. This was what mothers did. They cared for their sick children. I had never had children of my own. A long time ago, there had been a man, a love, a possibility of a different life. But circumstances and Margaret had conspired to steer my life down a different path, a lonelier path. Lily was the closest thing I had to a daughter, and she despised me. On Thursday morning, I packed a small overnight bag, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I drove to Margaret's house, a large, beautiful home in a wealthy suburb, a home that felt like a different world from my own small, inherited house. As promised, the key was under the mat. I let myself in, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Hello. I called out softly. There was no answer. I found a note from Margaret on the kitchen counter, written in her perfect, flowing script. Clara, thank you again. Lily is upstairs in her room. Her medicine is on the nightstand. The doctor's number is on the fridge. We'll be back Sunday afternoon. Love, M. Love, the word felt like a lie. I took a deep breath and made my way up the carpeted staircase. Each step was a step deeper into enemy territory. Lily's door was closed. I knocked gently. Lily, it's Aunt Clara. I'm here to look after you. The silence was my only reply. I knocked again, a little louder. Lily, can I come in? A muffled voice from inside, thick with sleep and sickness, said, Go away. Your mom asked me to come, I said through the door. She was worried about you being alone. Can I at least bring you some water? I heard a rustling sound, and then the door creaked open a few inches. A pair of fever-bright eyes peered out at me. Her face was pale and flushed, her dark hair a tangled mess around her shoulders. She looked so much like Margaret, but with her father's sharp intelligence in her eyes. And in those eyes I saw not just sickness, but that same cold animosity from the party. "I don't need anything," she said, her voice raspy. "I just want to be left alone." She started to close the door. "Lily, please," I said, a desperation I hadn't intended creeping into my voice. "Let me just help you. I can make you some soup. You need to eat something." She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Perhaps the fever had weakened her defenses. Perhaps the thought of warm soup was too tempting to resist. After a long moment, she sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, and opened the door wider. "Fine, but just leave it outside the door. I don't want you in my room." She closed the door before I could respond. I stood in the hallway, feeling the sting of the rejection. It was a small victory, I told myself. She had agreed to eat. I went downstairs and found a can of chicken noodle soup in the pantry. As I heated it on the stove, I looked around Margaret's kitchen. It was immaculate, a showroom of stainless steel and granite. Family photos adorned the refrigerator. Pictures of Margaret, Tom, and Lily on vacation, at Christmas, at birthday parties. A gallery of happy moments. I was in none of them. It was as if I had been carefully, surgically removed from the family history. I poured the soup into a bowl, placed it on a tray with a glass of water and a spoon, and carried it upstairs. I set it on the floor outside her closed door just as she had instructed. "Lily," I called out softly, "the soup is here." I waited for a moment, but there was no response. I retreated downstairs, feeling like a fool. I sat on the living room sofa, a piece of furniture I had never felt comfortable on, and listened to the silence. The house was a museum of a life I wasn't part of. Every object, every photograph screamed at me that I was an intruder. Hours passed. I read a book I had brought with me, but the words blurred on the page. All I could think about was the girl upstairs, alone in her room, hating me. Around noon, I went back upstairs. The tray was still outside her door, untouched. The soup was cold. My heart sank. I knocked again. "Lily, you need to eat, please." Silence. I knocked harder, a flicker of panic igniting in my chest. "Lily, are you all right? Please answer me." Still nothing. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. What if her fever had spiked? What if she had fainted? I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. "Lily," I whispered, stepping into the room. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. Lily was curled up in her bed, a lump under the covers, but my eyes were drawn to something else. On the floor next to her bed was an open book, but it wasn't a book. It was an old, leather-bound journal. My journal. The one I had kept as a teenager. The one I thought I had lost decades ago. And next to it, on the floor, was the silver locket she had dropped at the party. It was open, and I could see the tiny, faded photograph inside. A picture of two young girls, their arms around each other, smiling at the camera. A picture of me and Margaret, a lifetime ago, before the coldness set in. Lily wasn't asleep. She was propped up on her elbows, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a confusion so profound it seemed to eclipse her hatred. She was staring at me, not with animosity, but with a look of utter, heartbreaking bewilderment. In her hand, she clutched a yellowed page she had torn from the diary. "Who is Michael?" she asked, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "And why did you write that you gave him up for Mom?" The question hung in the air. A ghost from a past I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself it never existed. The silence in the room stretched for an eternity, filled with the weight of 40 years of secrets and lies. My carefully constructed composure, the emotional armor I had worn for decades, began to crack. Because in her hands, Lily held the key to everything. She held the truth. I looked at the diary in her hands, the one I hadn't seen since I was 18 years old. I remembered hiding it in a box of old books and photographs when our parents died, a box I must have brought here, to Margaret's house, for safekeeping and then forgotten. My entire past, my real story, was bound in that worn leather. "Where did you find that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "In the attic," Lily said, her eyes never leaving my face. I was looking for an old photo album. It was in a box with your name on it. I was bored. I started reading. She gestured to the page in her hand. I got to this part. I don't understand. Mom told me, she told me you were always jealous of her, that you never wanted her to be happy. The words were a direct quote from Margaret's arsenal of lies. It was the foundation upon which Lily's hatred had been built. That I was the jealous, bitter older sister, resentful of her beautiful, popular, younger sibling. What you were told is not the truth, Lily, I said softly, taking a hesitant step into the room. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The secret I had carried for a lifetime was out, and the world had not ended. Perhaps it was just beginning. Then what is the truth? She asked, her voice pleading. This diary, it's like reading about a different person. You write about art and wanting to go to Paris. You write about love. She looked down at the locket, then back at me. Mom said you never loved anyone, that you were too cold. I walked over to the armchair in the corner of her room and sank into it, my legs suddenly weak. I was not always cold, Lily, I said. And I did love someone, very much. His name was Michael. I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Michael Collins, the artist. Mom has one of his paintings in the study. She said he was an old family friend. He was more than a friend, I said, the memories flooding back, as vivid as if it were yesterday. He was my whole world. I began to tell her the story, the real story, the one that had been buried under layers of Margaret's convenient fictions. I told her about growing up, about how I was the quiet, artistic one, while Margaret was the social butterfly, the one everyone adored. I wasn't jealous of her. I adored her too. I was her protector, her confidant, her biggest fan. Our parents were traditional, I explained. They had very specific expectations. They wanted Margaret to marry well, to have a family. They wanted me to stay home, to be the sensible one, to look after them in their old age. They didn't approve of my dreams of being an artist. They called it a frivolous hobby. But this diary says you won a scholarship, Lily interjected, looking at the journal. A full scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago. I did, I said, a sad smile touching my lips. It was my ticket out, my chance to have my own life. Michael was already there. He was a year ahead of me. We were going to live in Chicago, paint together, and then, after we graduated, we were going to move to Paris. That was our dream. I could see the dream reflected in Lily's eyes, the romance of it, the tragedy. She was a young woman on the verge of her own life. She understood the power of a dream. What happened? She whispered. I took a deep breath. The next part of the story was the hardest. The summer before I was supposed to leave for Chicago, Margaret came to me. She was hysterical. She was 18 years old, just out of high school, and she was pregnant. Lily's eyes widened in shock. Pregnant, but she married Dad when she was 22. Yes, I said. The baby wasn't your father's. It was from a boy she had been seeing that summer, a boy who left town the moment he found out. Margaret was terrified. Our parents would have been horrified. In those days, for a girl from a good family to get pregnant without being married, it was the ultimate scandal. It would have ruined her. It would have destroyed her future. I remembered that night as if it were burned into my memory. Margaret, sobbing in my arms, begging me for help. Don't tell Mom and Dad, Clara, please, she had cried. They'll throw me out. My life will be over. She made me promise not to tell anyone, I continued, my voice growing thick with the memory of the pain. And she begged me for a solution. There was no easy solution. She was too far along for certain options, and she didn't want to give the baby up for adoption. She was scared and confused. I paused, gathering my strength. And then she said something that changed the course of my entire life. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen, and said, You could help me, Clara. You could say the baby is yours. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What? The plan was insane, I admitted. But we were desperate. She proposed that I would claim to be the mother, that I would go away for a few months, have the baby in secret, and then she and your father, Tom, who she had just started dating, would adopt it. They would tell everyone that I was a young, foolish girl who had made a mistake, and that they were the heroes, stepping in to raise my abandoned child. No one would ever know the truth. "And you?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "What about your scholarship? What about Michael?" "That was the price," I said, the words like stones in my mouth. "I would have to give it all up. I would have to tell Michael that I wasn't coming, that I had been with someone else, that I was pregnant. I would have to break his heart. And I would have to let everyone, our family, our friends, our entire town, believe that I was a disgraced woman. Margaret would be saved. Her reputation would be intact, but mine would be destroyed." Tears were streaming down Lily's face now, silent, hot tears of dawning comprehension. "You did that for her." "I loved her," I said simply. "She was my little sister. I couldn't bear to see her life ruined. I thought I was strong enough to handle it. I thought I was doing the right thing." I told her about the terrible phone call to Michael, how I had read the lines Margaret had helped me write, how I had listened to the sound of his heart breaking over the phone. He had called me a liar, a cheat. He had told me he never wanted to see me again, and he never had. "I went away to a home for unwed mothers a few towns over," I said, my voice now a monotone, the emotions too raw to express. "Margaret drove me there. She promised she would visit. She promised we would get through it together. She visited once. She complained the whole time about how depressing the place was. I spent 6 months there, alone, surrounded by other frightened young girls. I had the baby, a beautiful little boy with a tuft of dark hair just like Lily's. I held him for one day, and then, as planned, Margaret and Tom arrived. They signed the papers, they became his legal parents. And they raised him." Lily asked, her face a mask of disbelief. "No," I said, the final, most bitter piece of the story falling into place. "A week after they took him home, Margaret called me. She was crying. She said she couldn't do it. She said looking at the baby just reminded her of her mistake. She said Tom was having second thoughts, that raising another man's child was too much for him. She said they had found a wonderful couple, friends of a friend, who couldn't have children of their own. She said they had given the baby to them, a private adoption, no records. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that even now, 44 years later, it stole my breath. She gave him away, Lily. After everything I had sacrificed. After I had given up my dreams, my love, my reputation. She gave my nephew away to strangers because it was inconvenient for her." The room was silent, save for the sound of Lily's ragged breathing. She looked from my face to the diary, then back again. The hatred was gone from her eyes, replaced by a dawning horror. "So when Mom told me you abandoned your own baby," she started, her voice faltering. "She was telling you a twisted version of the truth," I finished for her. "She made me the villain of a story in which she was the victim. She told everyone that I had run off, had a baby, and then begged her to take it, only to abandon it with them later. It was the perfect story. It made her and Tom look like saints, and it explained why I never married, why I lived alone, why I was so cold. It was easier for her to live with that lie than to face the truth of what she had done. To me, and to her son." Lily slowly got out of bed and walked over to me. She was trembling. She knelt on the floor in front of me and took my hand. Her hand was warm, her touch gentle. It was the first time she had willingly touched me since she was a toddler. "All these years," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "All these years I hated you. I treated you so horribly. She told me. She told me you were jealous of her happiness with Dad and me. She said you tried to break them up when they were young. She said you resented me because I had the life you threw away." Every lie was a careful, deliberate brick in the wall Margaret had built between us. "I am so sorry, Aunt Clara," Lily cried, burying her face in my lap. "I am so sorry." I placed my hand on her head, my fingers sinking into her soft hair. The tears I had held back for 40 years began to fall, hot and silent. They were tears of grief for the life I had lost, for the love I had given up, for the nephew I had never known. But they were also tears of release. The truth was finally free. We stayed like that for a long time, an aunt and a niece, finally finding each other in the wreckage of a lifetime of lies. The flu was forgotten. The anniversary party was forgotten. All that mattered was this moment of raw, painful, beautiful truth. Later that afternoon, after the storm of emotion had passed, we sat together in the kitchen. I made us both some tea, and Lily, despite her sickness, insisted on making toast. It felt strangely domestic, wonderfully normal. "This Michael," she said, picking up the story again, her mind piecing together the puzzle. "He became famous, didn't he?" "Michael Collins, the landscape painter." "Yes," I said. "I've followed his career from a distance over the years. I've seen his paintings in galleries. He did move to Paris. He lived the dream we were supposed to have together." "Have you ever tried to contact him?" she asked gently, "to tell him the truth?" I shook my head. What would be the point? Too much time has passed. He's married, has a family of his own. The past is the past. Some things can't be fixed. Lily fell silent, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Mom, she has to tell you she's sorry," she said, her voice filled with a new, fierce determination. "She has to admit what she did." I gave her a sad smile. "Your mother has been living this lie for over 40 years, Lily. It's who she is now. I don't think she knows how to tell the truth anymore." "I'll make her," Lily said, a fire in her eyes that reminded me of my own youthful passion. "When she gets home, I'm going to confront her with this." She tapped the cover of the diary, which now sat on the kitchen table between us like a sacred text. The thought of a confrontation filled me with a familiar dread. For my entire life, I had avoided conflict with Margaret, always backing down, always smoothing things over. But this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was Lily's too. She had a right to know her family's true history. She had a right to know about the cousin she never met. "We will face her together," I said, surprised by my own strength. For the next 2 days, an unspoken truce settled over the house. Lily's flu began to subside, but she didn't retreat to her room. Instead, she stayed with me. We talked for hours. She asked me about my life, about my parents, about my dreams of being an artist. I pulled out old sketchbooks from the box in the attic, sketchbooks filled with drawings of flowers, of landscapes, of a handsome young man with intense eyes named Michael. Lily looked through them, her expression a mixture of awe and sadness. "You were really good," she said, tracing the outline of a portrait I had drawn of Margaret. In the drawing, Margaret was laughing, her head thrown back, a picture of youthful joy. "You made her look so happy." "She was," I said, "before the secret started." In turn, Lily told me about her life, her friends, her dreams of being a writer. For the first time, I saw her not as the angry teenager who hated me, but as a bright, sensitive, creative young woman. A young woman who was, in many ways, just like me. We discovered a shared love for classic literature, for old movies, for the quiet beauty of a rainy afternoon. It was as if a dam had broken, and 40 years of silence and misunderstanding were being washed away by a flood of conversation. She would read passages from my diary aloud, and we would talk about them. She was fascinated by the young woman I had been, a person so full of life and hope. "It says here you and Michael plan to name your first daughter Anna," she read one afternoon. Her eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "You lost so much, Aunt Clara." "I did," I admitted. "But in a way, I'm finding something new right now." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just my niece, but a friend. On Sunday afternoon, we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Margaret and Tom were home. Lily and I looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. The time had come. The diary was sitting on the coffee table in the living room. It felt like a ticking bomb. Margaret bustled in, all smiles and energy from her trip. "We're home." "Clara, thank you so much for everything. Was she a terrible patient?" she asked, winking at Lily. Lily didn't smile back. Her expression was serious, her jaw set. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Margaret's smile faltered. She looked from Lily's grim face to mine. "What is it? What's wrong?" She saw the diary on the table, and for a split second, a flicker of pure panic crossed her face before she masked it with a look of confusion. What is that old thing? It's Aunt Clara's diary, Lily said, her voice gaining strength. I've been reading it. The color drained from Margaret's face. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and accusation. You showed that to her. She hissed. She found it, Margaret, I said quietly. It's time, the lies have to stop. Tom came in then, carrying their suitcases. What's all this, everything okay? He looked at his wife's pale face, at his daughter's tear-streaked one, and at my own stoic expression. Mom, Lily said, her voice breaking but firm. I know about the baby, I know about Michael, I know everything. The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world crumbling to dust. Margaret stared at her daughter, speechless, her mask of cheerful perfection shattered, revealing the frightened, selfish girl of 18 she had never really outgrown. I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret finally stammered, reaching for the old, familiar comfort of denial. Clara has been filling your head with stories. She's always been jealous, Lily. She's trying to turn you against me. Stop it, Mom. Lily's voice rose, laced with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. Just for once, stop lying. I read it myself, in her own words. The words she wrote when she was 17, when she was giving up everything for you. She picked up the diary and thrust it at her mother. It's all in here. The scholarship, Paris, the plan you made her agree to, how you begged her to save you. Margaret flinched as if the diary were hot to the touch. She wouldn't look at it. Tom stepped forward, his face a canvas of confusion. Marge, what is Lily talking about? What baby? Margaret looked at her husband, her eyes pleading for an alliance, for him to help her shut this down. But Tom was looking at Lily, and he was seeing a pain that was real and deep. Tell him the truth, Mom, Lily insisted, tears now streaming down her face. Tell him how you got pregnant that summer. Tell him how you made Aunt Clara pretend the baby was hers so your reputation wouldn't be ruined. Tell him how she gave up the love of her life for you. And then tell him the best part. Tell him how you gave your own son away to strangers because you couldn't be bothered. Each sentence was a blow, and Margaret visibly staggered under the weight of them. All the lies she had told Lily, all the casual cruelties she had inflicted on me over the years, were now being thrown back in her face. It wasn't like that, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. It was complicated. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Lily shouted. Make me understand how you could do that to your own sister, the sister who saved you. How could you let me hate her my entire life? You poisoned me against her. You told me she was cold and selfish and bitter, but she's not. You are. The word hung in the air. You. Tom looked at his wife, his expression hardening. Margaret, is this true? Margaret crumpled. All the fight went out of her. She sank onto the sofa, her face in her hands, and began to sob. They were not the crocodile tears she had used in the past to gain sympathy. These were the racking, ugly sobs of a person whose entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies, a foundation that had just been dynamited. I was young, she cried, her voice muffled by her hands. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. You knew what to do, I said, speaking for the first time, my voice quiet but clear as a bell. You knew how to ask your sister to ruin her life to save yours, and you knew how to throw her sacrifice away when it became inconvenient. And then you knew how to spend the next 40 years making her the villain so you never had to feel guilty. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the diary. I held it in my hands, the worn leather a testament to the girl I used to be. You didn't just take my future, Margaret, I said, looking down at my weeping sister. You took my past, you rewrote my story, and you fed that poisoned version to your daughter. Of all the things you did, that is the one I can never forgive. Tom stood there, looking utterly shell-shocked. He had been married to this woman for almost 40 years, and he was realizing he didn't know her at all. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of respect, of understanding in his eyes. Clara, I never knew, he stammered. No one did, I said. That was the point. Lily went to her mother, but not to comfort her. She stood before her, her arms crossed, a judge delivering a verdict. "You are going to apologize to her," she said, her voice cold with a fury I had never heard from her before. "You are going to tell her you are sorry for every lie, for every cruel word, for everything you did." Margaret looked up, her face a mess of tears and makeup. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not remorse but the cornered terror of a trapped animal. She opened her mouth, but no apology came out, only a single whispered word. No. It was not a defiant no. It was a broken one. The no of a person who had lived a lie for so long that the truth was a foreign language she could no longer speak. To admit what she had done would be to admit that her entire life, her perfect marriage, her role as the beloved mother was a fraud. She couldn't do it. The lie was all she had left. Lily stared at her mother for a long, silent moment. The disappointment on her face was absolute. "Fine," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Then there's nothing left to say." She turned away from her mother and came to me. She took the diary from my hands and then took my hand. "Let's go, Aunt Clara," she said. "Let's get out of here." "Lily, wait," Tom called out, taking a step toward his daughter. "No, Dad," she said, not looking back. "I can't be in this house right now. I can't even look at her." She pulled me gently toward the door. As we walked out, leaving Margaret sobbing on the sofa and Tom standing frozen in the middle of the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. The war was over. I hadn't won, not really. There were no winners in a tragedy like this, but the truth had been spoken. The silence had been broken, and I was not alone anymore. I walked out of that house with my niece's hand in mine, leaving the ruins of a family behind, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was walking toward a future. Lily didn't let go of my hand the entire drive to my house. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. For 17 years, I had been an untouchable, a pariah in my own family. Now, this young woman, who had been my chief tormentor, was clinging to me as if I were a lifeline. We didn't speak. The silence was thick with unspoken emotions, with the ghosts of 40 years of lies. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the final, decisive battle has been won, and the survivors are left to survey the damage. When we pulled into my driveway, Lily looked at my small, modest house, the house she had probably only been inside a handful of times in her entire life, always with a look of disdain on her face. Now, her expression was different. It was soft, curious. "It's quiet here," she said as we walked inside. "It is," I agreed. "It always has been." She looked around the living room, at the worn but comfortable furniture, at the shelves overflowing with books, at my paintings hanging on the walls, the small, amateur landscapes I had continued to paint over the years, a secret hobby that was my only remaining connection to the girl in the diary. "I like it," she said softly. "It feels real. Our house feels like a magazine." I made us tea and we sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had sat so many nights, feeling the weight of my loneliness. But tonight I was not lonely. I was with my niece, my friend. Lily was the first to break the silence. "I keep thinking about what I said to you," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears again. "At the party, I can't believe I said those things. That I wished you had never been born." A sob escaped her lips. "I was just repeating what I've heard my whole life. Mom was always saying it in little ways. If it wasn't for Clara's drama, we could have. Or your Aunt Clara has always been a burden on this family. I grew up believing you were the source of all our problems." "I know," I said, reaching across the table and taking her hand. "It wasn't your fault, Lily. You were a child. You were taught to hate me, and your mother was a very convincing teacher." "She'll never forgive me for this," Lily said, her voice small. "For choosing you." "Maybe the question is," I said gently, "can you forgive her?" Lily was silent for a long time, staring into her teacup. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "Right now, I just feel angry. And so sad. Sad for you. Sad for the cousin I never knew I had." She looked up at me, her eyes full of a new, urgent question. Do you ever think about him, your nephew, my cousin? The question was a key, unlocking a door to a room in my heart I had kept sealed for decades. Every day, I confessed, the words coming out in a rush of long-suppressed truth. I think about what he looks like, if he's happy, if his parents were good to him, if he ever wonders about his birth mother, the woman he thinks was me. We sat with that thought for a while, the weight of a life unknown, a family member lost. The what-ifs were a tangible presence in the room. What if I had kept him? What if Margaret had? What if he was out there somewhere looking for a piece of his history? The ringing of the phone sliced through the quiet intimacy of the moment. We both knew who it would be. Lily looked at me, her eyes wide with apprehension. You don't have to answer it, she said, but I knew I did. The cowardly part of me, the part that had avoided confrontation for 40 years, wanted to let it ring. But the new Clara, the Clara who had found her voice in a courtroom of her own making, knew that the time for hiding was over. I picked up the phone. Hello. Clara, it's Tom. His voice was strained, heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond a long car ride. Is Lily with you? Yes, Tom, she's here, she's safe. Can I speak with her? I looked at Lily, who shook her head frantically. She doesn't want to talk right now, Tom, I said. She's very upset. I heard him sigh, a deep, weary sound. Clara, I need to understand what's happening. Margaret she's a wreck. She's saying you've turned Lily against her, that you've filled her head with lies from that diary. The accusation, as expected as it was, still stung. The diary is not lies, Tom, I said, my voice firm. It's the truth, a truth you have been a part of for 40 years, whether you knew it or not. Margaret says it's all twisted, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like a man repeating a script he didn't believe in. She says you were always unstable, that you resented her, that you gave the baby up and she and I tried to help, but you were too difficult. And you believe that? I asked quietly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted, his voice cracking. But she's my wife, Clara, and Lily is my daughter. This is tearing my family apart. Your family was already torn apart, Tom, I said, a sad resolve in my voice. The cracks were just hidden under a very expensive rug. Lily has a right to know the truth. She has a right to know who her aunt really is. And she has a right to know that she has a cousin out there somewhere. I could hear Margaret's voice in the background, a shrill, hysterical sound. Tom said something to her, trying to quiet her down. Look, Clara, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Lily is 17, she's still a minor. She has to come home. I'm not keeping her here against her will, I said calmly. She is free to leave whenever she wants, but I will not force her to go back to a house where she is being lied to and manipulated. That is not what is best for her. You're making this worse, he said, his voice rising in frustration. You're pouring poison in her ear. Lily, who had been listening to my side of the conversation, reached for the phone. I hesitated for a moment, then handed it to her. Dad, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Stop, just stop. Aunt Clara didn't poison me. Mom did for 17 years. She poisoned me with lies so she wouldn't have to face the truth. I'm not coming home, not until she apologizes. To Aunt Clara and to me. And not until she tells you the whole truth, without any of her twists. She listened for a moment, her face hardening. No, I don't want to hear her version. I want to hear the truth. And I've already read it. It's in black and white, Dad. Written 44 years ago, unless you think Aunt Clara is some kind of evil genius who planned this all out when she was a teenager. She took a shaky breath. I'm staying here tonight. I need some time to think. Please just leave us alone for a little while. She hung up the phone before he could reply. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were resolute. She had made her stand. The bond between mother and daughter, once so strong, had been severed by the sharp edge of the truth. He'll be back, I said softly. Or she will. I know, Lily said, wrapping her arms around herself. But I don't care. I'm not going back there, not to that house of lies. She looked at me, her expression shifting from anger to a fierce, protective determination. We can't just leave it like this, she said. What do you mean? My cousin, she said, the words tumbling out of her. The one they gave away, he's out there somewhere. He's family. He doesn't know anything about us. He doesn't know that his birth mother didn't abandon him. He doesn't know that he has an aunt and a cousin who would want to know him. I stared at her, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. For years, the thought of my nephew had been a private grief, a wound I never touched. But Lily was touching it, prodding it, not with malice, but with a desire for healing. Lily, that was over 40 years ago, I said, the practical, sensible part of my brain kicking in. A private adoption. Margaret said there were no records. We wouldn't even know where to begin. So we start with her, Lily said, her eyes gleaming with a new purpose. We make her tell us. She has to remember the name of the couple. She has to remember something. The idea was terrifying. It meant more confrontation. It meant digging up a past that was buried for a reason. It meant opening myself up to the possibility of more pain, more rejection. What if he didn't want to be found? What if his life was happy and we were just a disruption he didn't need? But then I looked at Lily. I saw the passion in her eyes, the fierce loyalty. This wasn't just about finding a lost relative. This was about justice. It was about righting a wrong that had shaped all of our lives. It was about reclaiming a piece of our family that had been stolen by a lie. And for the first time, the possibility of finding him felt not like a threat, but like a hope. A chance to create a new family, one built not on secrets and obligations, but on truth and a shared desire for connection. Okay, I said, the word feeling bigger, more significant than any I had ever spoken. Okay, let's find him. A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across Lily's face, a smile I had never seen before. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. In that moment, we were not a broken old woman and a disillusioned teenager. We were a team, we had a mission. The past had been a prison for both of us in different ways, but now it was a map, and it was time to follow it. The first step was to plan our approach. We couldn't just storm back into Margaret's house demanding answers. She would shut down, retreat further into her fortress of denial. We needed leverage. We needed a strategy. Your father, I said, an idea beginning to form. He's the key. He's in the middle of all this. He's shocked, he's confused, but he's not a liar. I don't think he is, anyway. If he can be convinced of the truth, he might be able to get it out of her. How do we convince him? Lily asked. With proof, I said, tapping the cover of the diary. And with a story he can't deny. My story. We spent the evening preparing. Lily, with her writer's mind, helped me organize my thoughts. We made a timeline of events, from the day I won the scholarship to the day Margaret gave the baby away. We gathered the evidence. The diary, my scholarship acceptance letter, which I had kept pressed between the pages of a book for 44 years, a faded photograph of me and Michael, looking young and impossibly in love. As we worked, I felt a part of myself I thought was long dead coming back to life. The sharp, analytical mind of the young woman who had been top of her class. The passionate heart of the artist who saw the world in colors and light. I was not just Clara, the quiet librarian, the cold aunt. I was Clara, a woman with a story, a woman who had survived. The next morning, Lily called her father. Dad, she said, her voice calm and businesslike. I want you to meet us for lunch, just you. Mom is not invited, and I want you to bring the painting. The painting. I heard Tom's confused voice on the other end. The Michael Collins painting from the study, Lily confirmed. It's important. Please, Dad. If you want to understand any of this, if you ever want me to come home, you'll be there. He must have heard the resolve in her voice, because he agreed. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in the next town over, neutral territory. Walking into that cafe with Lily felt like walking into a new chapter of my life. We chose a booth in the back and laid our evidence out on the table, the diary, the letter, the photograph. When Tom arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He carried a large, flat package wrapped in a blanket. He placed it carefully on the seat next to him. "Lily," he said, his voice hoarse, "you need to come home. Your mother is not eating. She's not sleeping. She's broken." "We're all broken, Dad," Lily said softly. "But we're here to start putting the pieces back together. The right pieces this time." For the next hour, I told Tom everything. I started from the beginning, using the diary as my guide. I told him about my dreams, about Michael, about the love we shared. I showed him the photograph. He stared at the young, smiling man, then at the painting he had brought, and a look of dawning comprehension crossed his face. I told him about Margaret's pregnancy, about the fear and the desperation, about the terrible plan she had conceived. I read him the entry from my diary, written the night I agreed to her plan, my handwriting shaky, the ink smudged with tears. "I am giving up the sun so my sister can have the moon," it read. "I hope she will be happy. I hope it will be worth it." Tom closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. Then came the hardest part. I told him about the home for unwed mothers, about the birth of his wife's son, about the day they came to take him. And then I told him how, a week later, Margaret had given him away. "That's not true," Tom said, his eyes flying open. "That's not what happened. We couldn't keep him. The social worker said, she said Clara was unstable, that she was unfit. And we couldn't handle a baby on our own then, we were too young. The agency found a good home for him. It was all legal through an agency." His words hit me like a physical blow. An agency, a social worker, unstable. Margaret hadn't just lied to me. She had created an entirely different reality, a legal fiction to cover her tracks and solidify my role as the unstable, unfit villain. She had used the system against me, turning my sacrifice into a mark of shame that was now, I realized, probably on some official record somewhere. "There was no agency, Tom," I said, my voice shaking with a fresh wave of rage. "There was no social worker. There was just Margaret on the phone telling me she couldn't handle it. She said she gave him to friends of a friend. It was a private arrangement." Tom looked utterly bewildered. "No, I was there. I signed the papers with the agency, Catholic Charities." The name of the agency was a lightning bolt. It was a real place, which meant Margaret's lies were more intricate, more devious than I had ever imagined. She hadn't just told a story, she had created a paper trail to back it up, a false paper trail. "Tom," I said, leaning forward, my eyes locked on his, "I was the one who gave birth to that baby. Don't you think I would know if I had dealt with an agency? Don't you think I would have had to sign papers? I signed nothing. The only thing I signed was the birth certificate, with a false name for the father, a name Margaret and I invented. She and I were the only two people who knew the truth." Lily, who had been listening in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation, finally spoke. "Dad, think about it. If it was a legal adoption through an agency, why lie about it? Why invent this whole story about Aunt Clara being a terrible person who abandoned her baby? Why not just say, 'My sister had a baby, we tried to help, but it was for the best that he was adopted by a loving family'? The only reason to create such a vicious lie is to cover up something much, much worse." Tom stared at the two of us, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the two realities, the one his wife had carefully constructed for him, and the raw, painful truth staring him in the face from his sister-in-law's eyes. He finally looked down at the package next to him and began to unwrap it. It was the painting, a beautiful landscape of a field of sunflowers under a stormy sky. It was one of Michael's earlier works, full of raw emotion and talent. In the bottom right corner was his signature, M. Collins. "Margaret always told me this was from a trip we all took to the countryside," Tom said, his voice hollow. "She said Michael was a friend of her father's, that he painted it for them as a wedding gift." "He painted it for me," I said softly. "The summer before I was supposed to leave. It was our field. We used to go there and dream about Paris." I pointed to the back of the canvas, which was covered in brown paper. "There's something written on the back. He wrote it the day he gave it to me." With trembling hands, Tom turned the painting over. He carefully tore a corner of the brown paper backing. And there, Written in faded black ink in Michael's familiar artistic scrawl were the words, "For Clara, my sun and my moon. See you in Chicago. All my love, M." The silence in the cafe was absolute. It was the nail in the coffin of Margaret's lies. It was irrefutable proof. Tom stared at the words, his face crumbling. He finally knew. He knew that the woman he had married, the life he had built, was all based on a terrible, selfish secret. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to see. "What did she do?" He whispered. "She saved herself," I said, "and she sacrificed everyone else." Tom was a changed man when he left that cafe. He took the painting, the diary, and the photograph with him. "I'm going to talk to her," he said, his voice grim. "I'm going to get the truth, all of it." Lily and I went back to my house to wait. It was the longest afternoon of my life. We tried to read, to talk, but our minds were elsewhere, in that beautiful, sterile house a few miles away, where a 40-year-old marriage was being torn apart by the truth. Finally, late that evening, the phone rang. It was Tom. "She told me," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "She told me everything. You were right. There was no agency. It was all a lie." She panicked. "She gave the baby to a couple she barely knew, a doctor and his wife from her father's country club. She doesn't even remember their last name, just that the wife's name was Aliner." Aliner, a name. It was the first real clue we had. "Is she sorry?" Lily asked, her voice small, almost hopeful. Tom was silent for a moment. "She's sorry she got caught," he said, and the bitterness in his voice was a chilling thing. "That's all. She's still trying to blame Clara, saying she put too much pressure on her." I closed my eyes. Of course, it would always be my fault. "What are you going to do, Dad?" Lily asked. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time I heard the sound of a man utterly lost. "I need to think, but Lily, I want you to know, I am so sorry for not seeing it, for believing her, for not being a better uncle to you, Clara." "It's not your fault, Tom," I said, and I meant it. He was a victim, too, in his own way. "I'm going to help you," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "I'm going to help you find him. I owe you that much. I owe him that much. I'll start at the old country club records. I'll find out the name of every doctor who was a member back then. We'll find him, Clara, I promise." When I hung up the phone, Lily and I just looked at each other. The fortress that was Margaret was crumbling, and in the rubble we were finding allies. We had a name. We had a place to start, and we had a promise. The search for my nephew had begun. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet suspense and profound change. Lily stayed with me. We transformed the spare bedroom, a room that had been filled with dusty boxes and forgotten things, into her room. We cleaned it together, hung her posters, and made it a space that was hers. It was a simple act, but it felt like we were building something new, a new version of family from the ground up. My little house, once a silent monument to a life half-lived, was now filled with the sounds of a young person's existence. Music I didn't recognize drifted from her room. The smell of burnt toast filled the kitchen in the morning as she tried to master my old toaster. We fell into a comfortable routine, a domesticity that was entirely new to me. We would read in the evenings, curled up on opposite ends of the sofa, occasionally reading a passage aloud to each other. For the first time, I felt like the head of a household, not just its solitary occupant. Tom called every day with updates. As he had promised, he began his search, but it was like looking for a ghost. The country club's administration had changed hands multiple times, and the membership records from the 1970s were nowhere to be found. He spoke to older members, but memories were faded, names were forgotten. The name Aliner was common enough to be useless on its own. It felt like Margaret's lies had been so effective that they had swallowed the truth whole, leaving no trace behind. With each dead end Tom reported, I could feel a sliver of despair trying to creep back in. But then I would look at Lily, her brow furrowed in concentration as she scrolled through online newspaper archives and genealogy websites on her laptop, and my hope would be renewed. She was relentless, a digital detective determined to unravel the mystery that defined our family. There were 3 doctors named Alistair in the state back then, she'd announce from the dining table, which had become our command center. But none of their wives were named Alina. One afternoon, while Lily was engrossed in her research, I felt a familiar pull, a longing I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I went up to the attic, to the box that had held the diary. Pushed to the very bottom, beneath old report cards and faded photographs, were my art supplies. A set of charcoal pencils, a hardened block of watercolor paints, a sketchbook with yellowed, empty pages. I brought them downstairs and sat in the garden. For the first time in over 40 years, I began to draw. My hand felt stiff and clumsy at first, a stranger to the tools it once knew so well. I sketched the rose bush my father had planted, the one that still bloomed every summer. I sketched Lily as she sat at the table, her face illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen, her expression a perfect mixture of youthful determination and old soul wisdom. As I drew, I felt a part of myself awakening. The colors seemed brighter, the world more vivid. I was not just a keeper of secrets, a vessel for old pain. I was a creator. I was an artist. Margaret had taken my future, but she hadn't been able to kill the part of me that made it worth living. It had only been dormant, waiting for a reason to wake up. The inevitable confrontation with Margaret came a week after Lily had moved in with me. I answered the door to find my sister standing on my porch. She was thinner, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held a cold, hard fury. She didn't look like a broken woman. She looked like a queen whose castle was under siege, and she had come to slay the dragons at her gate. "I want to see my daughter," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "That's up to her," I replied, standing my ground in the doorway. "Lily, your mother is here." Lily appeared behind me, her arms crossed, her expression a mirror of her mother's defiance. The 2 of them stood there for a long moment, a mother and daughter separated by a chasm of lies. "Are you ready to come home now?" Margaret asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Have you finished playing this little game with your aunt?" "It's not a game, Mom," Lily said, her voice quiet but firm. "And this is my home now, until you are ready to tell the truth, the whole truth, and apologize for what you did." "I have nothing to apologize for," Margaret snapped, her composure cracking. "I did what I had to do to survive, something your precious Aunt Clara was never strong enough to do. She just hid away with her little drawings and her sad stories. I built a life, a good life. And you too will not take that away from me." "What life, Margaret?" I asked, my voice filled with a sadness that surprised me. "A life built on the ruins of mine. A life where you had to poison your own daughter against me to keep your secrets safe. Do you call that a good life?" "It was better than being you," she spat, the words laced with 40 years of buried resentment. "Alone, pitied. A charity case for the family. That's what you would have been with or without me. I just gave everyone a reason for it." The cruelty of her words was breathtaking. She hadn't just covered her tracks. She had reveled in my demise, using it as the backdrop for her own perfect life. "Get out of my house, Margaret," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "This isn't over, Clara," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you've won because you have her," she gestured at Lily, "but you have nothing. Just a confused little girl who will come running back to her mother the moment things get hard. And you will be alone again. You will always be alone." She turned and stormed off, her parting words hanging in the air like a curse. Lily stepped forward and closed the door. She was trembling. "Don't listen to her," Lily whispered, her arms wrapping around me in a fierce, protective hug. "You're not alone, you have me." In that moment, holding my niece, I knew Margaret was wrong. Whatever happened, whatever the future held, I would never be truly alone again. The breakthrough came 2 days later. It didn't come from Lily's online searches or Tom's networking. It came from a place of simple human memory. Tom had been at his wits' end. The country club lead was a bust, and he was running out of ideas. In desperation, he had called his own mother, a woman in her late 80s living in a retirement community in Florida. He had asked her, on a whim, if she remembered any doctors from their old town, back in the 70s, whose wife was named Alina. "Oh, of course," his mother had said, her memory for gossip and social connections still sharp as a tack. "You mean Alina Finch. Her husband was Dr. Alastair Finch, the pediatrician. A lovely woman. Head of the garden club for years, very proper. They had one son, a quiet, dark-haired boy. A little sad, I always thought. They moved away ages ago, up to Vermont, I think. Said the city was no place to raise a child." Tom called us immediately, his voice crackling with excitement. "I have a name," he said, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. "Dr. Alastair and Alina Finch. They had a son. His name is Stephen." Stephen. The name echoed in the silent kitchen. It was a simple, solid, ordinary name, and it belonged to my nephew. After 44 years of being a nameless ghost, a secret sorrow, he had a name. Stephen Finch. I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Lily grabbed a pen and scribbled the name on a napkin, staring at it as if it were a holy relic. Stephen Finch. "Where are they now?" I managed to ask, my voice a croak. "That's the next step," Tom said. "But we have a name, a real name. We can find him, Clara, I know we can." After he hung up, Lily and I just sat there, staring at the name on the napkin. Stephen. A wave of emotions washed over me, terror, joy, disbelief, a profound, aching grief for the 44 years we had lost. He wasn't a baby anymore. He was a grown man, 44 years old, with a life, a history, a family of his own, perhaps. A life that had nothing to do with me. "What do we do now?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "Now," I said, taking a deep, steadying breath, a new resolve hardening within me. "Now we find Stephen Finch." Lily, ever the child of the digital age, was on her laptop within seconds. She typed Stephen Finch, Vermont into the search bar. The results were overwhelming. There were dozens of Stephen Finches, but Lily was methodical. "Okay," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "He would be 44 years old, so we can narrow it down by age. His father was a pediatrician. Maybe he's a doctor, too." She spent an hour cross-referencing public records, social media profiles, news articles. And then she stopped. "Aunt Clara," she said, her voice hushed. I think I found him." She turned the laptop towards me. On the screen was a website for a small woodworking business in a town called Maple Creek, Vermont. The About Us page featured a picture of a man with kind eyes and dark hair, threaded with a little gray at the temples. He was standing in a workshop, sawdust on his jeans, a gentle smile on his face. Behind him were beautifully crafted pieces of furniture, chairs, tables, bookcases, each one a work of art. His name was Stephen Finch. The biography said he had moved to Vermont as a child and had taken over the family business from his father, who was a beloved local doctor. It was him. I knew it with a certainty that was absolute and terrifying. There, on a glowing screen, was the face of the baby I had held for one day. He had my father's eyes, my breath caught in my throat. He was real. He was a woodworker. He had a gentle smile. He looked happy. "What do we do?" Lily asked again, her voice full of awe. The question was the biggest one I had ever faced. What do you do when you find a piece of your own heart that you thought was lost forever? Do you reach out and risk shattering his world? Or do you watch from a distance, content just to know that he exists, that he is well? I looked at the man on the screen, a stranger who was my flesh and blood. And then I looked at Lily, my niece, my champion, who had fought for this truth. I owed it to her. I owed it to the young girl in the diary who had given up her own sun and moon. And I owed it to Stephen. He deserved to know the truth of his own story. Not Margaret's version, not the Finch's version, but the real one. He deserved to know that he was not abandoned. He was sacrificed for, and he was loved. "We need to go to Vermont," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "I have to see him. I have to tell him myself." The decision to go to Vermont set in motion a whirlwind of activity. Tom, true to his word, became our logistical commander. He insisted on driving us, a quiet act of penance and support that spoke volumes. "I was blind for 40 years, Clara," he'd said over the phone. "The least I can do now is be your eyes on the road." He booked us a 2-bedroom suite at a small inn just outside Maple Creek, giving us a base of operations that felt both official and terrifyingly real. Lily, meanwhile, became my pillar of strength. She saw the fear that lurked behind my newfound resolve. The night before we were due to leave, she found me in the garden, staring up at the moon, my hands trembling. "What if he hates me?" I whispered into the darkness. "What if his life is perfect, and we're just a storm that's come to wreck it all? What right do I have to do that?" "You have the right of truth, Aunt Clara," she said, sitting beside me on the cool grass. She took my hand, her grip firm and warm. "He has a right to know he wasn't abandoned. He has a right to know about you, about the woman who gave up her own dreams so he could exist. That's not a storm, that's a gift." Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves. Looking at this incredible young woman, so full of fire and wisdom, I felt a surge of purpose. I was not just doing this for myself or for the ghost of the boy I'd lost. I was doing it for Lily, to show her that our family, for all its brokenness, could still choose truth over lies, courage over comfort. The drive to Vermont took a full day. The miles of highway unspooling before us felt like a journey back in time. With each state line we crossed, I felt like I was shedding a layer of the old Clara, the quiet, invisible woman who lived in the shadows. Tom drove in a focused silence, his jaw tight, his own internal battles raging. Lily and I sat in the back, the diary between us. She would read me passages from my own youth, and the girl who wrote them felt both like a stranger and my truest self. "You were so brave," Lily said, after reading the entry about my decision to tell Michael I was leaving him. "I wasn't brave," I corrected her gently. "I was heartbroken, and I was a fool for believing my sister." "No," she insisted. "You were brave because you chose love. You chose to love your sister more than yourself. That's the bravest thing a person can do." We arrived in Maple Creek as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quaint New England town. It was exactly as you'd picture it, a white-steepled church, a town green, streets lined with charming, independent shops. It was picturesque, peaceful, a perfect place to have a perfect life, a perfect place to keep a secret. Our inn was cozy, with a fireplace in the lobby and quilts on the beds. None of us slept well that night. The knowledge that Stephen was somewhere in this small town, sleeping in his own bed, completely unaware of the 3 strangers who had come to turn his world upside down, was a heavy weight. The next morning, we set out on our reconnaissance mission. Tom, a man used to corporate boardrooms, looked deeply out of place as he nervously navigated the small town streets. Lily had the address for Finch Fine Woodworking on her phone. It was on a quiet side street just off the main square. And then we saw it. A handsome, barn-red building with large windows displaying beautifully crafted furniture. A simple, elegant sign hung above the door. Tom parked the car across the street, and we just sat there, staring. It was real. We sat there for nearly an hour, a silent, nervous stakeout. We saw a few customers come and go. And then the door to the workshop opened, and a man stepped out to sweep the front step. He had dark, wavy hair with threads of silver and kind, thoughtful eyes that crinkled at the corners. He moved with the quiet confidence of a craftsman, his hands strong and capable. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sawdust-covered jeans. He looked up, squinting into the morning sun, and my world stopped. It was him. He was no longer the abstract idea of a man on a website. He was real. He was breathing the same air I was. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a sob. 44 years collapsed into a single, heart-stopping moment. He had my father's brow, and the same thoughtful expression Michael used to get when he was studying a canvas. A part of me, a part of the love I had lost, was alive and well and sweeping sawdust off a porch in Vermont. "That's him," Lily whispered, her voice full of awe. Tom just stared, his face a mask of complicated emotions. guilt, regret, and a flicker of something that looked like wonder. Stephen finished sweeping, gave a friendly wave to a passerby, and went back inside. The simple, normal moment was almost too much to bear. "We have to go in," Lily said, her voice resolute. "Not yet," I said, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I can't, not yet." We spent the rest of the day in a haze. We walked around the town, trying to act like tourists, but my eyes kept being drawn back to the red workshop. We learned from a chatty shopkeeper that Dr. Finch had passed away a few years ago, but his wife, Eleanor, still lived in town. She was a bit of a recluse, the shopkeeper said. We learned that Stephen was well-liked, a respected member of the community. He was married. His wife, Sarah, was a teacher at the local elementary school. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. My grandchildren. The thought was a physical blow. I had grandchildren. 2 children who had no idea their great-aunt, the woman who was biologically their grandmother, was sitting on a bench across the street from their father's shop, trying to find the courage to exist. That evening, back at the inn, the weight of it all finally crashed down on me. I had found him, and he had a life. A full, happy, complete life. A life that had been built on the foundation of his adoptive parents' love, a foundation I had no right to shake. "I can't do it," I said to Tom and Lily, the words tasting like ashes. "I can't destroy his peace. It's better this way. I've seen him. I know he's okay." That has to be enough. Lily knelt in front of me, her eyes pleading. "Aunt Clara, you've come this far. You can't turn back now. The truth isn't about destroying his peace. It's about giving him a piece of himself he never knew he had." "Your niece is right, Clara," Tom said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own complicity. "I spent 40 years living a comfortable lie because it was easier. Don't make the same mistake. The truth is hard, but it's clean. Lies fester." Their words gave me the last ounce of courage I needed. They were right. I had come here to break a cycle of lies, not to start a new one by hiding in the shadows of my nephew's life. The next morning, I put on my best dress, a simple blue one that Lily said brought out the color in my eyes. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was 62 years old, a retired librarian, a quiet woman who had never made a fuss. But today, I was going to make a fuss. I was going to walk into my nephew's life. We decided Lily and I would go alone. Tom would wait in the car. This was a family matter, and he understood that, for now, he was on the outside. We walked across the street, each step a monumental effort. My heart hammered against my ribs. Lily held my hand, her grip the only thing keeping me upright. We reached the door of Finch Fine Woodworking. I took one last, deep breath, and we walked inside. The workshop smelled of cedar and varnish, a clean, honest smell. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the beautiful furniture. It was a place of peace, of creation. Stephen was at a workbench in the back, sanding a piece of wood, his movements focused and graceful. He looked up as the bell on the door chimed, a friendly, professional smile on his face. "Good morning," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you with something?" His voice was calm and deep. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat had closed up. All the words I had practiced, all the speeches I had rehearsed in my mind, vanished. Lily squeezed my hand, a silent signal of support. "We're not here to buy anything," she said, her own voice a little shaky. "We're here to talk to you, Mr. Finch, about your adoption." The friendly smile on Stephen's face vanished. It was replaced by a guarded, confused expression. "I'm sorry," he said, taking a step back. "I think you have the wrong person. My parents were Alistair and Eleanor Finch." "We know," I finally managed to say, my voice a hoarse whisper. "We know they were wonderful parents. This isn't about that. This is about what came before." I stepped forward, my legs trembling. I looked into the eyes of my nephew, the eyes of my father, and I told him the truth. "My name is Clara Winters," I began, the words spilling out, clumsy and raw. 44 years ago, my younger sister gave birth to a baby boy. She was young and she was terrified. She couldn't keep him, so I helped her. I helped her find him a home." My voice broke. I was there the day he was born. I held him. His name, the name on his birth certificate, was Stephen. Stephen stared at me, his face completely pale. He looked from me to Lily, then back to me, his mind clearly struggling to process what I was saying. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not. My parents told me my birth mother was a young girl who couldn't take care of me. They never mentioned a sister." "She wouldn't have," I said sadly. My sister hid the truth from everyone, including the family that adopted you." I reached into my purse and pulled out the one photograph I had of me and Margaret as teenagers, the one from inside the locket. "This is us," I said, handing it to him. "My sister, Margaret, and me, Clara." He took the photograph, his strong, calloused woodworker's hands trembling slightly. He stared at the picture of the two young, smiling girls. And then Lily stepped forward, holding out the diary. "My great-aunt kept a journal," she said softly. "The whole story is in here, in her own words. We didn't come here to hurt you. We came here to tell you that you weren't just given away. You were loved. And the sister of the woman who gave birth to you has thought about you every single day for 44 years. Stephen looked from the photograph to the diary to my tear-streaked face. His expression was a chaotic storm of shock, disbelief, and a flicker of something else, a deep ancestral curiosity. The world I had built for him, the world Alina and Alistair had built for him, had been cracked open. He stood there in his quiet workshop, holding the pieces of a life he never knew he had. He looked up from the diary, his eyes, my father's eyes, locking onto mine. And in their depths, I saw not anger, but a universe of questions. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of 2 lifetimes, of secrets and sacrifices. And in that silence, I waited for the verdict that would define the rest of my life.